He uses research, science, statistics. And on day 74 of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, he sat down and ran the numbers. No named suspect. Not one. In 74 days. The FBI has reviewed tens of thousands of tips. Investigators have DNA from inside that house. They have blood from that porch, confirmed as Nancy Guthrie's. They have footage of a figure who walks onto that porch with a stillness that should not be possible in a person doing what that person was doing. And what this researcher found is not a theory. It is a profile built from data. And the data is more disturbing than anything this investigation has publicly produced. Before we go further, the analysis you are about to hear is the professional expert opinion of a named forensic researcher. It does not identify any individual. It is not an accusation. It is what the statistics say, presented by a person whose entire career is built on those statistics. That is more than enough to pay attention to. On day 74, Brian Enton, a News Nation correspondent who has been on the ground in Tucson covering this case, sat down with a forensic researcher, a person whose career is built on data, on peer-reviewed literature, on decades of systematic study of who commits violent crime in the United States, why they commit it, and what the behavioral evidence they leave behind tells us about how they are built. That researcher is Dr. Gary Brucato, and what he said on day 74 is the most specific, the most structured, and the most consequential analysis this case has publicly received. Dr. Gary Brucato holds a doctorate from the New School for Social Research in New York City. He served as assistant director of the Center of Prevention and Evaluation at Columbia University Irving Medical Center and the New York State Psychiatric Institute, where he conducted grant-funded research into early psychosis, violence risk, and the behavioral and psychiatric features of violent offenders. He co-created the Columbia Mass Murder Database, a systematic examination of worldwide mass murderers between 1900 and 2019. More than a century of documented cases, analyzed for behavioral, psychological, and psychiatric features. He has published over 50 peer-reviewed academic articles. He teaches, he consults, he conducts forensic evaluations for the City University of New York system. He is currently a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he works directly alongside Dr. Ann Burgess. And that name matters. Dr. Ann Burgess is one of the most consequential figures in the history of American criminal profiling. A forensic nurse and researcher who began consulting for the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico in 1978. The unit whose research and methodology became the foundation for the modern science of offender profiling. She worked alongside FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler. She helped conduct interviews with some of the most violent offenders in American history. She still teaches at Boston College, and she convenes what she has called her Super Sleuth Group, meeting regularly with former FBI profilers and cold case foundation specialists to work through unsolved cases. That is the professional world Dr. Gary Brucato works in. When he draws a conclusion, that conclusion is grounded in a framework that has been stress-tested against real cases, real evidence, and real outcomes. What he said on day 74 begins not with the footage, not with the crime scene. Between 76 and 92% of people who are killed in the United States knew their killer in some way. At the higher end, 92%. That statistic applies specifically to female homicide victims. 9 out of 10 women who are killed in this country are killed by someone they had encountered before. Someone whose face, whose voice, whose name was not entirely unknown to them. Now let's say this is actually a homicide. Up to 92% of people who are killed in the United States know their killer in some way. The estimates are between 76 and 92%, according to the various literature I've read. It is not the finding of a single study. It is a pattern that holds across the research with striking consistency. Brucato understands this fully. He is not claiming this number constitutes proof of anything specific about Nancy Guthrie's situation. What he is doing is establishing the base rate, the probabilistic starting point from which a disciplined analysis of the suspect pool should begin. Before the footage, before the behavioral read, before the character structure assessment, the starting number is 76 to 92%. And that number alone should reorient how every person following this investigation is thinking. The question is not, could this be a stranger? The question is, given what we know statistically about who kills women in this country, What is the most probable direction for this investigation to move? Consider what the approach to a stranger's front door would feel like, biologically, physiologically, for a person carrying out this crime. The human stress response is not optional. The heart rate spikes, cortisol floods the system. The body begins to manage the threat signals that come with being in an unfamiliar environment at night, armed with the intent to take a person from inside. Even in people with significant criminal histories, the approach to a high-stakes operation in an unfamiliar location produces measurable physiological distress. It shows in behavior, in micro-hesitations, in the scanning pattern of a person processing environmental threat signals in real time. It registers on camera, even when a face is completely hidden behind a mask. This person does not show it. The movement on that porch is deliberate, unhurried, controlled. The behavioral signature that analysts, investigators, and now Dr. Brucato have all described when reviewing this footage uses the same word every time. Comfortable, not nervous, not moving with the compressed urgency of someone who fears being seen, not scanning frantically for variables they haven't accounted for. Comfortable. As though this location, this door, this specific porch, and what was behind it, is not entirely unknown to them. I still think that probably the person knew her because of the comfort level. It suggests to me that they should be talking to anybody that has had a passing connection with her. The person responsible for this crime almost certainly had some prior form of connection to Nancy Guthrie. Not necessarily a close one, not necessarily a friendship or a trusted relationship. The connection could be indirect, peripheral, even entirely one-sided. A relationship in which the person responsible knew far more about Nancy than she knew about them. And that can include people that are very intimately aware of you, all the way down to people that just come to the house for trade work, or services or anything like that. It could be someone who worked at or near her home, a contractor, a landscaper, a maintenance worker, a service provider of any kind, who acquired, in the course of legitimate access to the property, a mental map of the location, where the cameras were, where the entry points were, what Nancy's rhythms and schedules looked like from the outside. It could be someone in the spaces she moved through regularly, her church, a restaurant she frequented, a medical facility she visited for pacemaker monitoring. It could be someone who knew her well. The data says almost certainly not a true stranger. Not someone who found her at random. Not someone for whom the specific details of her address, her schedule, her property layout, and her household technology were unknown quantities that had to be solved in real time. The data says this was targeted. Targeted requires prior knowledge. Prior knowledge requires a connection. And a connection means there is a person somewhere in the world this investigation inhabits, who carries information about who is responsible and has not yet brought it forward. The absence of visible distress on that porch is not the only thing Brucato identifies. What he describes is something more specific in its clinical implications. And what it tells us about the person responsible has direct consequences for how this investigation should be pursued and where it should be looking. When we see that, we start thinking about a person who probably has some psychopathic character structure. Because even somebody who is frequently committing crime, who isn't psychopathic, is going to look a little nervous. That is a clinical term. It carries a precise definition. And it is worth taking the time to understand it accurately, because misunderstanding it leads to misunderstanding what Brucato is actually saying, and what he is not saying. A psychopathic character structure does not mean violent at random. It does not mean uncontrollable in the colloquial sense. It does not describe the cartoonish figure that popular culture has constructed around the word. What it describes precisely is a person whose emotional architecture is organized fundamentally differently from the statistical norm. A person who does not experience fear, guilt, empathy, or social inhibition in the ways that regulate behavior in most human beings. The anticipatory dread of what you are about to do. The biological signal that functions in most people as a brake, as a deterrent, as the voice that says this is wrong and dangerous and you should stop. In this person, that voice is either significantly diminished or absent altogether. The figure on that porch is carrying out an act that would produce, in almost any person without this character structure, visible signs of physiological distress. Approaching a residential home in the middle of the night, armed, with the clear intent to take a living person from inside it, and doing so with a calm, a deliberateness, a behavioral stillness that is, in Brucato's analysis, not incidental, It is diagnostic. Brucato is not rendering a clinical diagnosis from footage. That distinction is important. He is applying a behavioral framework to a specific and visible data point, the sustained conspicuous absence of the stress response under conditions that should reliably produce it, and drawing a statistically grounded inference about the character structure of the person responsible. A psychopathic character structure does not emerge overnight. It does not arrive at an 84-year-old woman's front door as its first expression. It develops across time. It expresses itself in behavior across time, and that behavior leaves a trail. A person with this character structure, Brucato said on record, almost certainly has a prior history of criminal or antisocial behavior, not necessarily violent abduction. The extreme end of a behavioral spectrum almost never appears without prior, lower-level expressions of the same underlying structure. A person who can stand on a porch in the middle of the night, armed, without physiological distress, has been living with this character structure for a long time. That life has produced incidents, prior encounters with law enforcement, situations that registered with a neighbor, an employer, a former partner, a family member, a school, a court. A pattern of behavior that, viewed in retrospect through the lens of what happened in the Catalina foothills on February 1st, would trace a consistent and recognizable line. The person on that porch is not making their first antisocial decision. They are making what may be their most consequential one. But it is not the first. That prior history exists in databases. It may already be inside the systems the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department are actively working with. The person responsible is not a ghost who materialized from nothing and left no trace before this crime. They have left marks. Brucato's analysis of the character structure leads directly into a related question that the public discussion of this case has not addressed with sufficient rigor. Why Nancy Guthrie specifically? Not Savannah Guthrie. Not a public figure whose security profile would immediately trigger federal protection. Not a younger, more physically capable person. Nancy, 84 years old, living alone with limited mobility, a pacemaker, and a public family identity that made the financial circumstances of her broader family a matter of reasonable inference to anyone paying attention. Elderly women living alone are a documented category of targeted victim in the forensic literature on violent crime. They present a specific operational profile that certain categories of offender find systematically attractive. A predictable and observable routine, limited capacity for physical resistance, often reduced ability to summon help in the critical window of an attack, and a residential environment that a person with access reasons, legitimate or manufactured, can approach without immediately drawing suspicion. Nancy Guthrie fits this profile comprehensively. She lived alone. She was 84. Her mobility was severely limited. Sheriff Nanos noted on record that she could not walk 50 yards on her own. Her daily routine was fixed and knowable. Church on Sundays without fail. Family dinners. The same rhythms week after week for years. Her home was in a residential neighborhood that is quiet at night. And she had, as the mother of a nationally prominent media figure, a publicly known identity that allowed anyone paying attention to make reasonable inferences about her family's financial resources. If the motive involved financial leverage, and the evidence points strongly in that direction, then the selection of Nancy as a target reflects research, reasoning, and a calculated assessment of options. Someone evaluated this specific person at this specific address and determined that she represented the most viable candidate for what they were planning. That kind of assessment does not happen in a moment of impulse. It happens over time, through observation, through the accumulation of knowledge about a target, and the accumulation of that knowledge required proximity. It required, again, some form of prior connection. Here is where Brucato's analysis takes a turn that the public conversation around this case has not fully absorbed. If there is more than one person involved, and I strongly suspect there is, the person we're seeing on the camera is sort of like the waiter. And behind the scenes, there's some sort of chef. The person on the porch is the waiter. Someone else, someone who does not appear on any footage investigators have released, is the chef. The waiter carries out the task that is exposed. Stands on the porch. Approaches the door. Bears whatever physical risk the abduction entails in the moment. The waiter is not the architect. The waiter is the instrument. The chef designs. The chef selects the target. The chef determines the timing. Why 1:47 in the morning specifically? Why this night? Why this window? The chef understands the camera placements. where the Nest device is mounted, how to approach the door in a way that addresses it before it records anything usable, whether a secondary interior camera exists, whether its footage would be retrievable without an active subscription. The chef accounts for the 41-minute window. What must happen inside it? In what order? With what contingency, if something does not proceed as expected? The chef solves every logistical problem that simply standing on a porch with a backpack does not solve. The chef sends the waiter. And before we go further, if you have been following this case and you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Every development in this investigation, every expert analysis, every new piece of information that shifts the frame, you will not miss it. Subscribe and stay with this, because this next part matters. The chef-waiter framework finds specific and concrete support in the physical evidence. Savannah Guthrie disclosed in her Today Show interview that the rear doors of the home were found propped open when the family arrived. Not forced, not broken, propped, actively held in place. She described the family's initial confusion. They thought perhaps Nancy had suffered a medical episode in the night and paramedics had come because the back doors were propped open. And that didn't make any sense. What it eventually made sense as was something far more deliberate. Propping a rear door requires knowing the door is there. It requires deciding in advance that it will be operationally useful as a secondary entry point, as an exit route, as a logistical element of a plan that was mapped out before anyone arrived at that address. A person improvising alone in an unfamiliar house in the dark does not prop a rear door. A person executing a plan developed by someone who already knew the layout of that home does. The chef in Brucato's reading is the figure who understood this house, who had knowledge of the interior layout, of the camera positions, of Nancy's schedule and physical condition and daily patterns, of the technology installed at the address. That knowledge does not assemble itself. It is gathered deliberately, over time, through access, through sustained observation, through a relationship, direct or indirect, with someone who had that access. The public conversation about this case has been dominated by the figure on the porch. That is understandable. The footage is the most visible artifact of what happened, and it commands the eye. But Brucato's analysis redirects the attention. The porch figure is not the source of this crime. The porch figure is the execution of it. The source is the hidden figure, the one no camera caught. The one whose knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's life was granular enough to make this operation possible. And somebody out there has already crossed paths with that person, has been in the same room, has had a conversation that at the time seemed entirely unremarkable. A question about Nancy, or her household, or her neighborhood, that only registered as strange in retrospect. The chef does not wear a mask. The chef does not stand on a porch in FBI-released images. The chef appears in ordinary contexts, and the tip that leads investigators to the chef may be sitting in someone's memory right now, waiting for the right question to surface it. One of the most significant investigative developments in this case, and one that the public discussion has not given sufficient analytical weight, is the decision by investigators to send the recovered glove for genealogical DNA analysis. Genealogical DNA analysis is the methodology that became nationally known through its role in identifying the Golden State Killer, the serial murderer and rapist who evaded capture for more than 4 decades before investigators used DNA from a public genealogy database to trace his family tree and ultimately identify him as Joseph James DeAngelo. The technique does not require a direct hit in the conventional criminal DNA database. It works laterally. It identifies relatives of the person who left the DNA, builds a family tree outward from those genetic connections, and narrows down to the individual through a combination of genetic genealogy, geographic information, and traditional investigative work. The fact that investigators chose to apply this methodology to the glove found near Nancy Guthrie's home tells us something specific. It tells us that the conventional database search, the standard CODIS check, either returned no result or returned a result insufficient to identify a suspect. It tells us that investigators believe there is genetic material on that glove worth pursuing through the longer and more resource-intensive genealogical route. And it tells us that they have committed to a methodology that does not require a prior criminal record to eventually produce an identification. The mixed DNA found inside the home adds a separate layer of forensic complexity. Genetic material from more than one contributor, recovered from the same location, requires a more sophisticated analytical process to separate and profile. It takes time. But DNA does not diminish. It does not become less usable with time. The Golden State Killer's DNA sat in an evidence chain for decades before the technology to fully exploit it existed. That technology now exists, and investigators are actively applying it. Brucato does not stop at who is responsible. He goes further into what he believes is statistically most probable about what happened inside that house during the 41 minutes no camera was watching. And when he reaches that territory, the analysis arrives at its hardest destination. There's one of two scenarios that occurred here. Either a person or persons went in to kill this victim and made an attempt to stage an abduction. They travel different paths, but they converge on the same difficult ground. The first scenario. The abduction was staged from the beginning to look like a kidnapping, but the actual intent was never ransom. The presentation, the notes sent to media outlets, the Bitcoin demands, the apparent expectation of negotiation, was misdirection. It created the appearance of a financial motive and a living hostage situation, which directed investigative and public attention toward the assumption that Nancy was being held somewhere alive, awaiting a transaction. The chef in this scenario understood exactly what that misdirection would accomplish. It bought time. It created a false investigative narrative that would consume resources before it could be fully tested and discarded. The goal was never money. The goal was something else entirely, achieved or attempted under cover of the appearance of a kidnapping. The kidnapping was genuine. The intent was financial. The operation was designed to take Nancy Guthrie, hold her, and leverage her family's resources and Savannah Guthrie's public profile into a payment. But the plan encountered something it had not fully calculated: Nancy herself, the human variable that no operational plan fully accounts for. She is 84 years old and described as physically fragile. But fragile does not mean passive. An elderly woman, frightened, removed from her home, her medication, her pacemaker's monitoring connection, in the middle of the night, under extreme duress. The medical variables alone create conditions that a kidnapping operation built around the assumption of a compliant, transportable person could not reliably predict. What happens to a pacemaker-dependent person under acute physiological stress? What happens when the medication she requires daily to manage her heart condition is absent from the first hours forward? These are variables that the people who planned this operation assessed based on their expectations of an elderly woman. Their expectations may have been wrong in ways they had no recovery plan for. In this second scenario, something went wrong, not as a metaphor, but as a literal operational failure. A medical event, a resistance they had not anticipated, a complication that made the original plan, hold her, receive payment, release her, impossible to execute. And when execution became impossible, a different decision was made. The kidnapping became something else. Detective Brian Martin, a cold case specialist with the Fort Wayne Police Department in Indiana, articulated this in precise and specific terms. He believed the kidnappers underestimated Nancy Guthrie's health. That when a medical event occurred, when the situation became, in his words, incredibly stressful and very taxing on somebody, Nancy was no longer of value to a financial operation. And when she was no longer of value, the calculation of what to do next changed. Things went sideways. Things went wrong. And what they had to do, it sounds horrible, they had to dispose of Miss Guthrie because she was no longer of value to them. Dr. Ann Burgess, the forensic nurse and researcher whose work with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit formed the foundation of modern criminal profiling, addressed the physical evidence from the scene directly. She said on record that she believed something went very wrong inside that house. She looked at where the blood appears, at what the blood's apparent trail and volume do and do not explain. She asked the question that 74 days of investigation has not publicly answered. Where does it go? She said it plainly. It just vanishes. She just vanishes. The blood goes somewhere. Nancy goes somewhere. And as of day 74, no investigation, no press conference, and no public statement has answered where. Brucato's final conclusion, the one that this community and this audience has not yet had to sit with in fully explicit terms, is the one that requires the most care and the most honesty to present. Based on the behavioral and statistical profile he has constructed, the psychopathic character structure, the prior criminal history that structure implies, the involvement of more than one person, the operational sophistication of the planning, the two scenarios under which the kidnapping either became something else or was never what it appeared. Brucato said on record, My statistics also tell me that if she is deceased, there is a very low chance that she will ever be located intact. He does not say she is deceased. He is explicit on that point. Law enforcement has not confirmed it. The investigation remains open and active. The family continues to hold the hope that any family must hold, and rightly so. Nothing in this episode, and nothing in Brucato's analysis, should be interpreted as a verdict on Nancy Guthrie's fate. What Brucato is saying is narrower and more specific than that. It is a probability assessment applied to a specific category of offender. The type of person who exhibits the behavioral profile visible in this case, who approaches a targeted abduction with the calm of a psychopathic character structure, who plans with the operational sophistication of a chef directing an operation through a waiter, who has a prior criminal history consistent with that structure, tends in the research literature to approach the elimination of evidence with the same thoroughness that characterized the commission of the crime itself. This is not a figure who leaves loose ends by accident. A person who planned this carefully in advance, who addressed the cameras, who prepared the entry points, who chose the timing with precision, tends to apply that same operational logic to what comes after. The number is not a verdict. It is a probability assessment derived from a rigorous academic methodology, honestly applied to the most difficult question in this case. And because it is the most honest and the most rigorous assessment this case has publicly received, it belongs in the record of what is known and evaluated about what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of February 1st. 74 days. No named suspect. A $1.2 million reward. An FBI investigation that has worked through tens of thousands of tips and still has not landed on the person or the people who took Nancy Guthrie from her home in the Catalina foothills. Dr. Gary Brucato's analysis does not solve this case. No forensic profile does that by itself. What it does is narrow the frame, and narrowing the frame is exactly what an investigation at this stage needs. Because a narrowed frame gives the public a more specific target for the information they may be holding, without knowing its significance. The person responsible is almost certainly not a stranger to Nancy's world. They almost certainly have a prior history, visible somewhere in a record, in a law enforcement database, in an institution's files, in someone's memory of a pattern of behavior that was troubling before it became criminal. They almost certainly did not act alone. There is a chef, a more calculating, more hidden figure whose knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's home, her routine, and her life made this operation possible. And someone in the community this investigation is moving through has probably already shared a space with at least one of them, in a context that did not announce itself as significant at the time. That is the nature of the chef. The chef does not wear a mask. The chef does not appear on a doorbell camera. The chef appears in ordinary contexts, in conversations, in the access they had to Nancy's property, in the questions they may have asked about her schedule or her household, in the knowledge they demonstrated that only someone paying deliberate, sustained attention to her life would possess. If something connects to Nancy's home, to her household staff, to contractors or service workers who had access to her property, to anyone who expressed unusual interest in her schedule or her family connections, to anyone whose behavior around the time of her disappearance has stayed in your memory, even slightly, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Pima County Sheriff's dedicated tip line remains active. What you know may not feel significant enough to report. Brucato's framework says it may be exactly the piece this investigation is missing. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 74 days. Her children Cameron, Annie, and Savannah are still searching. Investigators are still working. The data says the person responsible is findable, that they have left marks in the world, that they are known to someone, that the connection between who they are and what happened in those 41 minutes on February 1st exists somewhere in human memory, waiting to surface. If this analysis reached you, if it shifted the frame, clarified the picture, brought something into focus that was not in focus before, share it with someone who follows this case closely, with someone who lives in Tucson or has a connection to Nancy's neighborhood or her world, with someone who has been carrying a thread of information and has not known what to do with it. The data says the answer to this case is probably already in someone's memory. The only question is how long it takes to reach investigators. Subscribing keeps you with this investigation as it develops. Every expert analysis, every development that shifts what is known, every new piece of information that changes